Hello and welcome. I'm really extremely hope that you're in the mood for this session after that music. Welcome to our session, our symposium about thinking critically in, Alison's just sharing, thinking critically and ethically about research for education. We are encouraging you to put questions in the chat. And we do ask, we've arranged the session so that there will be 15 minutes left at the end for us to have questions and discussions. So if you would, like to ask questions, if we could hold them to the end, that would be great. Without further ado, let's move on to Alison Fox talking about critical ethical reflexivity for practice and knowledge. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmel. I'm sharing the screen, so I'm assuming that that I'm able to be seen, and this is a good chance to segue into the papers. So they're all papers that are derived from a book that's coming out with Routledge in November. More details about that at the end of all of the 5 presentations. But my first paper is actually sort of extending beyond the book towards a paper that I'm in conversation with Hugh about, and I realise I should be a joint paper really, Hugh, because we're starting to put some ideas together for a special issue of Education Sciences for an editorial paper. The call's still open for that. It's the call's on ethical regulation and practice, and so if you want to get in touch with us, please do if you're interested in writing for that special issue. So I've been developing with colleagues and with many doctoral researchers in 3 universities I've been working in, an ethical appraisal framework that is not an original framework, but it's been derived originally from the bringing together the work of 2 colleagues, David Seedhouse and from healthcare, and David Flinders from educational research, who we've came across the work of, who'd done the work of gathering together some of the ethical traditions of thinking that had informed their advice to researchers. And when I was working with a colleague, we realised that these 2 frameworks, sort of sets of traditions, although they were coming from different origins, sort of merged and conflated on one another. And so I've been working in practical applications of what I've ended up calling the CERD framework, and I've built an ethical appraisal support website at the University of Leicester, which is open access, around this for supporting early career researchers, all researchers. I use it myself, and 2 open learn courses, a future learn course, a massive open online course, People Studying People, and an open learn course through the Open University, Becoming an Ethical Researcher, which sort of reflects and works through this framework. But I've been becoming more uncomfortable with the fact that these are Western traditions of ethical thinking. And the more I try and work with researchers who are working in non-UK, non-Western context, I've been working with researchers thinking, well, where do we go from this framework? How do we take this framework and apply it in our work, or do we even take it at all? And that's what I really wanted to explore today. So I wanted to walk through the 4 different traditions that underpin aspects of the framework, and ask some questions about where they're taking me and my thinking, and the researchers that are working with these lines of ethical thinking. So going back to the origins first, really, of the utilitarian strand of the framework, which had its origins in responses to the Nuremberg trials and the commitments of originally scientific researchers, but has heavily influenced all the social science and educational research frameworks that have come ever since the World War II experimentation, that people and societies were adamant that they didn't want to be associated with again. So all of the sort of calls for inviting in participants, protecting them, anonymizing and de-identifying them, giving them options to withdraw, have all derived from these early origins, and have really been given as the rationale for the underpinning approaches that we take to contemporary ethical appraisal. Utilitarianism itself has perhaps, been manipulated and taken in different directions that not everybody would agree with. If you're thinking about maximizing the benefits for the wider good, you might do that at the expense of individuals' protection and identification, as the WikiLeaks have taken on board as their mission. They've made decisions on what they think is in the public interest. The way that I merged these two traditions was to start to explore the philosophical sort of side of utilitarianism that has been called consequentialism, that really focuses on the anticipated consequences of the study. And the more that I've worked with people with this, what people take away is the sort of ability to write into your study the possibilities to identify your beneficiaries very early on in a study, and to work through your research design to maximize the positive consequences, or the likelihood, or the working with people is where this takes people to find out how this study that you're developing might most benefit them and others, and working out who those others might be, of course, as well as balancing that against minimizing the risk of harm. So really, I'm wanting to sort of use that to sort of reclaim what we could be thinking about in terms of utilitarianism. And if you think about it in the terms of the consequences, how can we reclaim this sort of ethical thinking for research participants? By protecting, and I've got this image that was drawn in response to the GDPR and the data protection. And this is, are these hands grasping and taking the data away for specific uses, or are they protecting and caring hands? Because by protecting and overprotecting, are we actually silencing the fact that we don't study, or we're at risk of not studying those groups that might be too difficult to study, too vulnerable? Is there such a thing as being too vulnerable? Aren't we then not allowing those voices to be heard? And there's lots of studies to show that working, with anybody is possible. And there's wonderful examples in this Vera conference. So then we need to think about whose voices are we empowering? How are we listening? And the consequences of those hearing take us to places, and I know Martina's work relates to this, of places where actually you might want to name and claim your voice. And I'm referring to Martina's work because she's working with Twitter. And these public spaces, are people wanting to have their voice claimed and named and acknowledged, or are people in these spaces, if they're going to be used for research purposes, wanting to be anonymized? I'll leave that over to you to pick up, Martina. So the second tradition is about ecological thinking. David Seat has called this external thinking. But I come from a biological background myself, and I was brought up, I was an environmental scientist with the scientific understandings of the interconnectedness of one another. And I love embracing the post-human presentations in Vera conference here, where we're really placing ourselves. We've got the post-human work, and we've also got sort of actor network theory that I think, again, Martina's work will pick up on. And you may be familiar with Bronfenbrenner's interpretation of this in terms of child development and how that's informed a lot of our research. But applying it to ethical research appraisal contexts, this is an example of how I applied it to a study where you're just looking at identifying all of those, not just the participants, but all of those who are involved with and affected by a study, and thinking then about who we're responsible to, and then starting to think of how we might be responsible to those various others. But these aren't restricted to Western notions of science. Ecology itself, has origins in the Greek language. But actually, there's so many societies where the way that people live and steward their land is embedded and embraced, and is now started to be talked about in ways that we should be hearing. And I think about Canadian researchers and those working in Australasian contexts that really start their presentations by recognising the ownership of the land of the area that they now work and live in. I'm also supporting researchers in African contexts, and have come across Ubuntu that I'll mention a couple of times in this presentation as really embracing the place of people in their world. So how do we embrace these other ways of thinking about ecological living and being? They're not just a Western way of thinking. So on to the third dimension. So we've got a relational strand of thinking that both David Seedhouse and David Flint had identified from traditions, which sometimes come from the healthcare system. It's obviously got a duty of care built into it. Victoria Held talks about this. And also David Flinders highlights the history of feminist writers, Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings in particular, that really started us to think about ways of placing the relationships central and core and overriding to the way a project develops. And this was actually the approach I originally took to the beginning of my own PhD, but then started to worry about the other aspects of ethical thinking that I needed to pay attention to. So this, when you start to look beyond a Western way of thinking about this, and you start to think about perhaps humanitarianism philosophies, we can trace it back, to 1841, the Chartist movement and utopian societies thinking about communal ways of living as a philosophy where the community has more priority than the individual. So a different interpretation. But the current proponents of that are still, if you look in the literature, are people like Michael Walzer and Charles Taylor from the USA and Canada. So still Western philosophers are really being heralded. But when you are working in African context, and particularly any of the contexts that embrace Ubuntu, it's embedded in their societies. It's embedded in all the proverbs, the songs, the oral traditions, the way they work, that I am because we are. You can't be human all by yourself. These are some of the traditions that are passed down, perhaps not in academic texts, but in the way that Ubuntu is lived and worked. And lovely to see so much of this starting to be written about and talked about. And we need to find ways of embracing, particularly if we're working in African contexts, to come together to find out the value systems that are embraced in those systems and see how they connect with the values that we're holding personally. I'll come back to that just at the very end. So the final tradition is often the one that people first think about. If you're thinking about passing through an ethical appraisal board, you might start to think, right, okay, what are the duties and obligations I've got? What do I have to do? What do I have to meet? The regulations of to make sure that I'm going to get through this ethical appraisal procedure. And the image here has some of the questions that you would be asking yourself, particularly on the data protection side of your study. These are synthesis of the GDPR, which is in the UK, the Data Protection Act, originally in 2018, but updated to align with the GDPR in 2021. So the same questions apply to us in all of those settings that want to align themselves with the GDPR. And so there are lots of codifications of the obligations that we should have in society, this just being one example. But are these the only obligations we have? Are they only the ones that are written down and codified and we are demanded to follow, that we should really be paying attention to? I just wanted to draw attention really to three of the examples of things that of ways of thinking about these obligations, perhaps going back to the ecological tradition of identifying who and how and where you and in what ways you can work with a setting. And the example that I've got just an image of here, but the full paper reference is in the references slides, is of my colleague Bukola Oyeleye, who has worked in her setting to develop a moral ethical framework with the participants that embraces the existing ways of thinking, knowing and coming to know, and has embraced that and adapted that for the study that she was carrying out in Africa. I also presented at the Research Ethics Conference in Exeter this year with colleagues Injaru Colundas-Bolus and Raphael Mitchell from the Transforming Education for Sustainable Futures Network, and you can see all the organisations represented with that. And how they talked about in their presentation about coming together to share ways of thinking about ethics and not imposing any one system on any of the projects in their network. And finally, I wanted to point attention to a local group of people who've taken it upon themselves to tell us if we want to work in the San people's area of Africa, then we need to apply to their research ethics system. I don't know whether you've come across this before, but this San Code of Research Ethics was launched in 2017, and those peoples came together and they explicitly created and codified the expectations of anybody that wanted to research in and with them. So I just wanted to say that where I was really coming to in the discussions I've been having with Hugh, that we want to write into this paper and to have discussions within our universities and our discussion spaces like this one, is to really think about ways of connecting our histories as the starting point. This is a reference to some work by Gominda Bambra that Ndlovu Gacheni writes about, and again I've got those in the reference list, to really come together for this sort of pluriversal approach to embracing our own traditions, hearing about other traditions and seeing where we can move forwards together. And so this is the reference list that can be available for anybody who's interested to follow up any of those that I've cited today. So that's over from me, and I'll hand over to Martina, who's going to share her own slides. So I will stop my slideshow now.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm just about to share my slides and I hope you can see them now. Can you see them? Just need a bit of, I hope I can anybody talk to me or let me know whether you can see them?
Just need to be in full presentation mode.
They are actually.
No.
On my side they are, and I used the button that I used last time.
Right.
Should I give it another try?
Yes, if you could, please.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, because we can see the slides, but not in slideshow mode like last time. Okay. So you have shared the screen.
Okay, so still not in slideshow mode?
No.
I'll try again, not to worry. These are the joys and beauties
if it worked once,
of
it'll work again.
working with technology, exactly. So let me just share my slides again. Right.
Thank you for those who are commenting and reflecting, and Carmel's going to be able to pass on any thoughts that we can pick up at the end. Whilst Martina,
can you see my slides now?
I can see them, but they're not in presentation mode. I think if we just go with that, Martina, it's annoying, but I think it's better than spending too much time.
Okay, good. I'll start then. Okay, so yeah, well, it's just the way it is. As I said, it's the joy and beauties of technology. I will actually share my slides later on via SlideShare anyway, via Twitter, so people can access it from there as well. So today I would like to talk about my doctoral research, which actually looked at freelance language teachers' professional development on Twitter. And one thing I have grappled with for a long time, and I'm still not done with it, is actually Twitter and research ethics, because that's an endless topic. But today I would like to concentrate on the things that you can see on the overview slides, which is I will briefly give you a background of my doctoral studies. Then I will go into freelance language teachers' professional development and Twitter, and also talk a little bit about freelance language teachers and their precarious working conditions. I will then move into Twitter and explain why I think that Twitter is much more than a tool. And then I will point out ethical challenges connected to Twitter research. And some of these challenges are actually persistent, regardless of which guidelines, ethical guidelines you're using. And last but not least, I would like to show you some pathways into doing Twitter research ethics differently. Okay, so the background of my studies, I investigated freelance language teachers' Twitter-based professional development. I finished my thesis in 2019, and I did my, well, first of all, I started out from a socio-cultural theoretical framework, but then I went into Deleuze-Guattarian ontology. And in the end, I developed a Deleuze-Guattarian post-structural, post-human research framework. So what does this mean? It means that I actually worked with Deleuze-Guattarian concepts, and in particular with the concepts of rhizome, assemblage, and becoming, to produce the study. This is a completely different understanding of doing research, or what it means to do research, than simply looking at doing research in a linear fashion, where you first write your concept, then you start with data collection, then you start with data analysis, and in the end you come up with a conclusion, or conclusions rather. This is more a sort of relational framework that Alison referred to in her presentation as well. She talked about relations, and this is very much the background here as well. So in my understanding of Twitter is not a platform or a tool or a medium, but Twitter is all of these three things in any given situation, and more than that. So just imagine when we go back to the first picture, and you might have looked even on the small screen, you might have seen that there's a person with a smartphone in her hands. And the idea here, which is very central to my understanding of what's going on when you actually tweet, what it means to be tweeting, is that in any given situation, when you pick up your phone and open the Twitter app, what happens is that assemblages of human and non-human actors are being formed. And these assemblages have the power of producing something. So tweets, in my understanding, are situated comings together, assemblages of human and non-human elements in the act of tweeting. So the research questions I asked myself in my study were different from other people's research questions. Some researchers look at how humans actually use Twitter for their professional development, and whether what they do with the tweets has any effect on their teaching. What I was interested in was actually, how does freelance language teachers' Twitter-based professional development work? How does it work? And what do these assemblages of situated comings together of humans and non-human elements in the act of tweeting, what do they produce? So this, as I said, is a completely different way of looking at things. Now, going into freelance language professional development, freelance language teachers, in my understanding, are engaged in language teaching. These are language teachers, obviously engaged in language teaching for one or multiple educational organizations in one or multiple educational sectors without a full-time permanent work contract. So in other words, freelance language teachers are heavily dependent on market forces, are heavily dependent on the demand, and they are heavily dependent on other people telling them whether they have got the competences, or whether they are what higher education institutions or the private sector is looking for in a particular teacher. And obviously, the other thing that very much determines what freelance language can do or cannot do are the fees. We are talking about well, so you see that sometimes in the market sector, we've got institutions that pay so little money that freelance language teachers have to have an enormous workload just to get by, basically. And they have never any security. They work sometimes just for the contact hours. So in other words, all the preparation for language teaching is not paid for. So freelance language teachers, in summary, suffer from precarious working conditions, which also impact upon their institutional professional development activities. In other words, what they can do and what they can't do, as Beaton and Gilbert found in 2013. Freelance language teachers have only limited access to organized formal professional development. This is something that Uschi Stickler and I found in a previous research in 2015. And the main barriers, when we talk to language teachers, the main barriers for them that sort of prevented them from taking part in formally organized professional development was actually time and money. So Twitter could actually be a way for freelance teachers or teachers in general to overcome such barriers to taking part in professional development. Because Twitter is available 24/7 and it is free upon registration. So you can, as of now, you don't have to pay anything for it, apart from paying with your data, but that's another story. So Fisser and colleagues found that Twitter gives teachers opportunities for self-directed professional development. And Wesley found that language teachers use Twitter for community-based professional development. The problem with that, of course, is that Twitter is much more than a tool for professional development and research. Because, as I said, previous research looked more towards the human side of things. But this is actually a bit of a sort of, I'm not saying this is not the right way to look at things, but this is just tells one side of the story. Let's put it this way. Now, Twitter is more than a tool. Why am I saying this? Twitter's terms of service determine how users and researchers can interact with the platform. Now, of course, you could argue that when you sign on Twitter, you actually agree to their terms of services. But honestly, have you actually ever looked at the terms of services? And even if you did, do you fully understand what's written in there? The second problem with Twitter is that Twitter's functionalities and the algorithms that Twitter uses, they influence human behavior and they evolve dynamically, which means there are complex relations between Twitter users and Twitter as a platform. And this goes on Twitter and beyond Twitter, because there are third-party services which actually interact with Twitter as well. Just for instance, you could do a little experiment by typing in your name into Google. And if you are on Twitter, see what comes up. That would be very interesting. And it will show you that there are many third-party services that can actually look at what you're tweeting on Twitter. Researchers need to acknowledge, in my view, researchers need to acknowledge more that there are human and non-human voices in Twitter research. And on the right-hand side, I've given you an example. This is a visualization taken from the book that Alison mentioned earlier on. And in this visualization, which actually looks at the data collection sites that I used in my doctoral research. So I collected data from narrative frames, from online meetings. I investigated Twitter networks, and I also conducted online interviews with 6 research participants. And in all of these sites, I collected data. And the instruments I used for collecting data actually are non-human actors and they interact with human voices, and they have a certain effect. Together they produce the study. So it's not so much about me as a researcher producing a research study. It's more acknowledging that there is a multiplicity of voices included in producing a study about Twitter, for instance. And Twitter is not just a platform. It's not just something that we use in research, that we use for research, sorry, that we research, but also we use Twitter in research. Why am I saying this? Because if you as a researcher are on Twitter yourself, you are also interacting with the platform. And this voice, for instance, should be heard equal and should be equally heard and should have a certain value in your, and you should acknowledge this voice, just like you acknowledge the voices of human participants. And this is my point, you should also acknowledge the non-human voices. But the problem is that researchers are faced with multiple and changing ethical challenges in Twitter research, because Twitter is not a static platform. As I said previously, Twitter's functionalities and their algorithms, they evolve dynamically. So when you tweet something, Twitter's algorithm picks up on that and uses it in the recommendations that Twitter gives you for connecting with people or for looking at content, for instance. And in this way, there is a constant and changing relationship between humans and non-humans. The ethical challenges in Twitter research will, of course, if you start doing research, there are very valuable guidelines that could help you research that could help you navigating the territory of ethical challenges in Twitter research, such as the BERA framework or the latest framework that the Association of Internet Researchers came out with in 2020. But there are persistent challenges, and the challenges I would like to point out in my talk today actually relate to data privacy, data ownership, and the researcher position. So I think there is more and more, or there's a growing awareness among researchers now that tweets are not necessarily or cannot necessarily be treated as public data. However, some researchers are still of the opinion that tweets are actually public data. Why is that? Because Twitter users actually agreed to the terms of services, and the terms of services, Twitter's terms of services state that tweets can be used for research. So researchers might argue that obtaining consent from research participants is not necessary. And in some cases, when we think about big data, analyzing, millions of tweets, this consent you might not be able to actually obtain that consent. And ethical review boards may actually follow this argument, but the question persists, is this enough? Data harvesting in Twitter is actually relatively easy. And there are programs or software, there's software such as NodeXL or Text Explorer, which can actually help you. And you don't really have to be a tech wizard to be able to use these tools to analyze tweets. And Twitter actually allows researchers via their API to use tweets for research. Now, the question is, how do these non-human actors, the software, interact with Twitter data? So which data is actually harvested and which is not, or what data is not harvested? And how are the collected data manipulated for data analysis? You might have come across these wonderful pictures of Twitter networks and you think, wow, that's amazing. That is so colorful. That is just wonderful. And some people might actually think that this is an objective analysis of Twitter data. Now it's not, because there are functionalities within NodeXL and Text Explorer which determine what the picture looks like. And so by tweaking a picture to make it look like something, you also influence how people look at the data that you are at the analysis, what they understand from the from the networks that you analyzed. So the visualizations are actually very powerful, and they have an own voice, so to speak. Another problem area, in my view, is data ownership. Now, as I said, users agree to Twitter's terms of services upon registration, and so you might assume that they know that their data could be used for research. Now, question is, are participants really aware of the terms of services? And how do they feel about their data being used in research? There are actually research studies that point out that Twitter users are quite opinionated when it comes to their data. In my own research, one of the research participants actually said to me that she would like to know when I was collecting data, because otherwise she would feel violated. She really used the word violated. And at the time, I really noted this down because I was so impressed. And I hadn't actually thought about this because in the beginning, I thought I would actually collect data from the research participants without, well, after having received their consent, of course, that I could collect the data. I wouldn't actually tell them when I was collecting the data, so that I wouldn't actually influence their behavior in tweeting. But after speaking to this research participants, I decided to change my schedule there. And I informed research participants of the time when I would be collecting their data. Because to me, that was much more ethical than not telling them. Another thing that I mentioned earlier on is the researcher position. There are researchers who actually are on Twitter and who use Twitter not only for research purposes, but also to disseminate their own research. But if you tweet a lot as a researcher, that gives you a certain power within networks. And you have to make this power that you have actually visible in your research. You have to disclose what you use or what you use Twitter for and how you're using this. And also how you might actually be, accidentally or not, interact with your research participants outside of your research study. And the crucial questions, of course, is how do researchers use or users of Twitter and their experiences influence their research? So, last but not least, my pathways into Twitter research ethics, or into doing Twitter research ethics differently. In my view, providing a comprehensive descriptions of the technologies which are employed in and for Twitter research help uncover the ways in which non-human actors actually interact with the participants, researchers, and other technology in the production of a research study. Because all of these, as I said earlier on, all of these human and non-human actors, and well, I call them elements. In other research traditions, they speak of actors. How do these human and non-human actors interact in the production of the research study? I think if we provide more comprehensive descriptions of these interactions, Twitter research will become more ethical. Another thing that I found is that comprehensive descriptions of the non-human voice in a research study enhance research reflexivity. So if you think about how you use a particular software to produce a particular visualization of the Twitter network that you investigated, that helps you become more reflective about what it is that you're actually doing there, and why this strengthens a particular voice within your research, but might also weaken another voice. And these comprehensive descriptions could actually be used regardless of ontological differences. So in other words, you don't have to follow the Deleuze-Guattarian route, by no means. You could actually use a socio-cultural framework and still provide this comprehensive description I'm talking about. Last but not least, understanding the researcher position as an element involved in multiple relation and research processes, and describing one's own involvement in these processes in detail contributes to developing different and more ethical research practices. So instead of looking at the researcher and as a kind of eye in the sky, as Donna Haraway once famously put it, I think it's essential, it's elemental to actually show the researcher position and make it more visible in Twitter research. And in my own view, the researcher position is an always in between. Now, thank you very much. I would like to, I will stop sharing here now. I have also provided my references, but I will stop sharing here now. And I will hand over to Carmel, who is now talking about what it means to investigate or do investigations with young people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martina. Alison, I believe you are sharing my slides, if you could, please. And I apologize for all those people that don't like next slide, please. But I find that I'm going to trip over myself. There. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so moving on from that, my paper is about little people and big thoughts. So I'm particularly interested in accessing young people's experiences by developing ethical methodologies. If we could move on, please. And the images that you see throughout this come actually from my research. So they're not just pretty pictures, but they are research that has come from the participants in the research. So things I think that when you're working with children and young people that researchers need to follow, I think the key thing is that they're used to being non-participants. So we need to be actively inviting them to contribute, and not just once, but many times. And I think it's quite often in ethical research, we have this issue about ethics committees pursing their lips and saying, ooh, should we be researching with these children? So it's picking up on the point that Alison made earlier on about silencing difficult to study groups. So we also need to be wary of coercion and ongoing assent and not one-off consent. And this gets a bit more difficult because in order to access the children in any research participation, we need to go through adults. And it can be sometimes that teachers or parents will assent and give their written consent, but the young person or the child is not so much. So I think it's perhaps there's a need for, as the Sand people had their own code of ethics, perhaps we should be looking to find out ways in which children and young people can come up with their own code of ethics. And this identifying and establishing a relationship and recognizing that this may time. And quite often as researchers, we are on a timeline, either by doing a PhD and having to hit certain targets or being a funder and certain dates. And we're perhaps too ready to jump into the research. I'd say that it's sort of adults as well as children. But we need to take awareness that when we're researching with children and young people, that we need to take the time and develop that relationship. If we can just keep moving on, Alison, I'll stay with you. So young people may be wary of the hierarchy, so could check the adult position. I know in my own research that I've had, I remember one young woman of 14, 15, and she started using swear words, and I could see her making eye contact with me, and I just didn't react. And it was like, I'm not your teacher, I'm not your parent, I'm a researcher, and I know that young people of that age use swear words, but I wasn't going to kind of impose my adult position on her because it just wasn't appropriate. And it's valuing what young people say needs to demonstrate an acceptance of their experience. So another sort of situation, and you'll meet him a bit later on, is I always encourage my participants to use their own pseudonym and you know, so that's kind of a way of protecting their true identity. And one young boy wanted to be called Unhearable. And his mother was saying, oh, that's a silly name, you can't use that. But I'd actually just said, you can choose a name of your own choosing. It's up to you, just so long as it's not your own name. So by then, did I then renege, or did I kind of say that, look, I'm taking this forward? And it may take more time to develop methods. That, you know, interviews with adults may be fine, but it may not work the same way with children. And check for understanding, but avoid reinterpreting what is said. So actually making sure that you're understanding. I always think of Piaget in this term of him imposing his own observations of what the child was saying and interpreting, rather than trying to understand the child's perspective and their use of language. Okay, and clarity of language is key. This is something in my own work that I found. I once said to one study I was doing, I didn't think clearly and precisely enough. And I think being literal with language is so important. Okay. So, United Conventions of the Rights of the Child, most of us that work with children and young people, this is central to our work. And I've just picked out a couple of points here. So Article 12 states parties shall assure to the child who is capable, these are my italics, capable of forming his or her own views with the right to express those views freely in all matters affecting the child. Due weight. And I think we're seeing this currently in COVID-19 vaccinations, when there is a conflict between child and parent, whose right prevails. And then the child shall in particular be provided with the opportunity to be heard in any judicial and administrative proceedings. I always think it's quite important that education is not specifically mentioned. Article 23 identifies the right of the disabled child has effective access to and receives education and training, but there's no mention of participation in the identification and provision. But maybe this is assumed from Article 12. So I think there's sort of hints, but again, we're hearing that adult voice. So let's think about why young people are excluded often in the educational context. And I think the first point to mention, if we go on, Anne Kennisted, who's done a lot of research in this area, she synthesizes into child's rights in education, points out the following points. There are different demands required of education. So, for example, the government sees it as a means of increasing economic performance. Feel free to disagree with me. Parents have expectations for successful performance of their child, not necessarily involving their child. In many countries, education is output-driven, focused on results and placement in international and national league tables, for example, PISA tables. Educational institutions are very hierarchical, with adults being in control and requiring children to be passive and powerless. And I'd go one step further and say that even within that adult hierarchy, there are quite often times when certain adult members of staff are silenced. And there's a widespread belief that particularly young children do not have the cognitive skills to effectively contribute to policies, methods, and practices. Again, there is not the time available for teachers to consult children, as it detracts from teaching time. And another point is the formal frameworks for consulting children do not actually exist. I mean, we might say there are things like school councils, but those of you who've been in touch with school councils, they're not always taking the ideas forward. And then the potential conflict between parents' rights and children's rights. And again, we're hearing that in the current COVID vaccination situation. And then child development theories focus on stages and abilities based on age, rather than, and I think those of us that work closely with children really understand that children's experience and what they can and do understand are very different. So children who are involved in caring duties, I would say they're quite often very more adult behaved than children who don't and who live in more protected environments. Okay, so researching with young children, back to the research then, what is it saying? That young people's views are often collected via adults. And I found this in my own work, that quite often it's a case of the parent will answer the question, or the parent by the professional, be it health professional, educational professional, will ask the parent about the child. I've also found that parents' views and children's views may be different. So I think this is a driving force for me and why it's important that we do maintain a focus on the child's point of view. Suitability of the methods. This is a really interesting paper by Bird and Co. It's based in health research, but it looks at that really we need to think about developing many more different views and ways of accessing children in research methods. And then the power imbalance between adults and children, young people, needs managing. The Lowe paper, she talks about the unauthorized voice of the child, and her paper is about kindergarten children. So gaining informed consent and ongoing assent. This is a growing issue, that it's not just a one-off thing. And children have all sorts of different little methodologies by which they demonstrate they don't really want to be part of the participation in the research. Time and resource implications, going back to the Bird paper, and this ever-present situation of time that's upon us. And the perceptions of children, young people as competent and capable, this sort of whole are they becomings or beings issue. And the consideration of which parts of the research process do we want children involved in is something perhaps we don't think through. We might think about their involvement in the data, but not necessarily in the research method, contributing to that, or in the analysis of the data. And negotiating ethical approval. And I think I have kind of, from my own perspective and from colleagues, sometimes ethical boards want you to do something and you think, actually, no, that's going to take away from the research. But how do you fight or overcome that barrier? Okay. Working ethically with young people in research. So setting the context for this, she says. So throughout the design of the research of the two studies I'm discussing, I was keen to consider ongoing assent by young participants, particularly where consent is thought through parents and guardians. And I'm increasingly aware that it is a responsibility of research to consider the impact of the child, young person, after the research study has concluded, raising expectations and legacies of participation. I've been to a number of presentations across the years where people have talked about getting this data and talking about school democracy, and yet then, because perhaps the teachers haven't been involved, nothing's happened with that data. And my view of young children and young people are that they are more competent than is generally acknowledged. And however, there are issues around language, hierarchy and method. So, okay, if we move on. So this is Stewie. Stewie's a participant in a project in which I was looking at the long-term impact, the impact of having glue ear or otitis media, a fairly common childhood condition, which a lot of medics will say, oh, it ends about 7. But what are the long-term implications? So Huey was 10 when he was involved in this. And what I asked the participants to do was to create a photo montage and a number of issues about what it was like for having glue ear. So Stewie sort of separated into the goods and the bad. And he talked about being stressed, when he was perhaps in class, becoming angry and frustrated because he didn't understand what was going on and when teachers didn't respond to him. But when he was in his athletics and his football, he felt as though even when his hearing was down, he could at least participate. There were other issues around that from his mother's perspective, but from Huey's perspective, from Stewie's perspective, they were really kind of positive things for him. And again, he was the one that created these images. And for me, in this methodology, it was about if he didn't produce the images, then the data wasn't produced and there was nothing there. But also, it gave him time. He chose, I gave him sort of 3 weeks, and he chose what he included and what he didn't include and what he was prepared to talk about with me. So what we did was, when we were talking about his photo montage, it was like, which of these images do you want to talk about first? What do they mean to you? So as a researcher, you can call it, I call it a participant-led discussion rather than an interview. And in that, he talked about the importance of what life was like for him without me putting things in his mouth or asking him specific questions. So very quickly, the second project is, again, this is hearable. I always call him heroable, but he called himself hearable, just couldn't spell it. And this was a diary type format. And again, the child, in this case, because he was 7, was in control of what he wrote, what he discussed, and what he actually wrote down. And the 3 colors relate to his ability to understand a targeted speaker. So green was, I can understand all or most. Brown was, I could understand little or none. And the pinky color, mauve, was, I can understand some. So these are just kind of very quick examples of the ways in which perhaps we can put the child or young person in control of the data collection. So if we can move on. So my take-home messages. Researcher position. What is your theoretical framework? What is knowledge and who has it? How much freedom, involvement, control can participants have from your researcher perspective? What are the restrictions upon you? And then the young people's capability. Are young children, young people, beings or becomings? Beware of the relation of children construct childhood-adult relationships. The unauthorized child needs encouraging and needs to be able to express their voice. And then the methodological innovation. It is a case of trial and error, not always something that ethical research boards will agree to, but be prepared to make modifications and justify them. And I've created this idea of a circle of going back to the research board and saying, the participants now want to do this. Can I have chair's action on this? And it can be time consuming, but it can also be extremely rewarding. So some references there. Alison and I are co-conveners of this SIG, so our names and emails are pretty readily available if you want to share them. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll now pass over to Nalita. No, sorry.
Hello everybody. I hope you can hear me. I don't know if my slides are showing or not. If someone could just pop in the chat that they are or they aren't, I can try again. No, I don't think my slides are sharing. Let me try again. I don't know why my slides are not sharing.
Just breathe.
I'm breathing.
Fine. The joys of technology.
My slides are gone. Alison, do you think you could share the slides if that's possible? Because for some reason they're not sharing or showing.
Is that okay?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. That's technology for you. But thank you. It's great to be here. And thank you very much for just being patient with me. So this paper draws on a piece of research that myself and Hugh Busher, who's going to present the final paper of this symposium, did a few years ago, which was based on, if you want to move the slide forward, Alison, based on a 2-year project which was looking at access to higher education, a diploma program which is aimed at adults who are 19 plus who for whatever reason haven't been able to access higher education and who have no or low qualifications, who have failed their A-levels and they want to go to university. So the study that we carried out was based in 7 FE colleges in the Midlands of England, and we used a case study design, a linked case study design to collect and triangulate a range of qualitative and quantitative data, which included participatory visual methods of data collection with these students who were enrolled on the Access to HE diploma. And we did that across 7 further education colleges. And the purpose of having that approach to our research was about strengthening the trustworthiness of the study. But we really wanted to ensure that the students and the colleges who were involved in the research were reflective of the context in which the study was taking place. So there was a range of social contexts in the regions. We were working in colleges in large urban and industrial areas. We were working in rural areas, and our colleges were a mix of small and large colleges. So it was really important in thinking about the research ethics around design, about ensuring that our study appropriately represented those participants involved in the study. And then also in terms of the data collection, our design involved undertaking group interviews, and we wanted our participants to explain their taken for granted intentions and assumptions about their educational journeys and transitions that they were making as they progressed through the Access to HE diploma. But more significantly, and what I'm going to focus on today, we worked with 32 students across our colleges to draw what we describe as mind diagrams of their learning journeys, to illustrate and prompt their individual thinking, and also as an opportunity for us to explore this approach really in this particular context. Alison, can you just go back one slide? I'll let you know when to move forward. Thank you. So at the forefront of our study, there was an ethics of care and a dignity for our participants. That was really, really important, given the backgrounds and the context in which these adult learners lived out their lives. So many of them had low or very limited education, had really struggled in school. There was financial hardship, negative school experience. Some were out of work. They lacked self-confidence. There was low self-esteem. So we designed this study to accommodate the participants' circumstances and perceptions of themselves. And also, really important, and I'll come back to this later in the presentation, we accorded our participants the ability to make those decisions for themselves as to whether they wanted to participate. So, and reinforcing the importance of seeing from the participant, from the perspective of the research participants, which was really, really important. So moving on to the next slide. What is a mind diagram? How did we use that? And so for us, an important element of the project was about encouraging the participants to reflect on their past and prior experiences of learning, how they saw themselves as learners, and how that was shifting and changing. And for us, this participatory visual method, which we identified as a mind diagram, was a really good starting point to help participants to develop their understandings of themselves and their learning. But also it was an opportunity for us to collect spontaneous data, which wasn't just relying on text. It was about their ideas, their pictures, that could be displayed in a way that they chose, not just necessarily reliant on the kind of more formal approach of concept mapping, which can be more structured and less creative. We really wanted our participants to take ownership of their mind, of these diagrams, and actually in doing so, reflect on what that meant for them. So it was really putting them in control of the data, which is a point that's been made earlier. Moving on, Alison, a couple of examples of our mind diagrams, which were created following rules that we set out to our participants so they could visually express their views of their social situations. And what we really wanted to achieve by using this approach was a different perspective on the world that can often be missed through the written and the spoken. We wanted to use the data to create an enriched picture, really, of our participants' thinking. And moving on to the next slide, there was often a very, and here you can see this, an eclectic approach, an eclecticism of shapes and a layout amongst the drawings. And very often it was about who am I and where do I see myself and what's my position and what's my voice in this process of learning. So it was very, very much influenced by the I and myself. So these approach in our research didn't come without some ethical challenges, and I want to share 3 of those with you. And I've also posed some questions which for you as the audience to reflect on and think about as researchers who have used this kind of approach or are thinking of doing so, and some of the issues that to reflect on. So I mean, the first issue around this is around confidentiality. So for us, the mind diagrams offered a real powerful and significant means of our participants communicating their reflections on how they were transitioning through the Access to HE program. So it was opening up new ways of seeing and knowing for them, but the important thing here is it was the individual, and this has already been reflected on in some ways, it was the individual participant who created those mind maps. And sometimes it would often include very personal data, which in some ways could be used to directly or indirectly identify them. So one of the things that needs to be reflected on is this whole issue around confidentiality and anonymity, and whether that becomes tricky, particularly when individuals are not only representing themselves, but then begin to start to represent others in that mind diagram. And this raises questions, I think, about participants' rights and that becomes particularly pertinent in relation to participant-generated data. So these mind diagrams, as I said, were data created by participants, that they were owned by the participants. So it raises the question here as to what right do researchers actually have to alter these mind diagrams in the interest of anonymity. And the point is, it's not just about legal issues of copyright here, but it's actually related to moral arguments about ownership and about the production of images as a personal creative process. So the next one to reflect on is around minimizing harm, which is a key ethical consideration for all research, and it's the responsibility of the researcher to mitigate the harm experienced by participants and others involved in the research. And when thinking about this in relation to this type of participatory visual research and using mind diagrams, where again we can see sensitive reflections or personal imagery, the researcher then is given the consent then to access those kinds of intimate spaces, really, which might not necessarily be shared in other forms. And it raised the question for me anyway about, do we really fully understand what the implications of participation therefore might mean for the individuals, and for us, for the students who are taking part in this Access to HE study. So it's something that we need to think about and be mindful of when we use this kind of approach. And then consent, and clearly a fundamental application of respect is to ensure that participants are able to make decisions about their research participation, as I've already alluded to, particularly where in our study we had individuals who had very low self-esteem and very low self-confidence. And as we know, consent is important in terms of ensuring that their participation in research is voluntary, and that they have the sufficient information and adequate understanding of the purpose and aims of the research. So in relation to this particular issue, and again thinking about that in relation to the mind diagrams that we use, it raised an issue about, it's not just about collecting data, but it's also about how we use that data then in terms of analysis, presentation, and dissemination. It may be difficult for participants to fully understand the effects of producing these mind diagrams, but it's evident that they do have the potential to tap into powerful memories or beliefs that can might result in discomfort or potential emotional harm. So the onus is on the researcher here to explain any of those potential consequences, even when consent is granted. And we had an ethical duty to consider the risks that the publication of such data might hold for respondents. So even here in this forum where I've presented the mind diagrams of our participants, what are the implications for that in terms of that sense of ownership? And so it's really important to give careful consideration to the political, the social, and the cultural context in which these images can be viewed and actually interpreted. So moving on, Alison, to my last slide. I want to end on a really positive note. By undertaking the research with an ethic of care for our participants, and in using our mind diagrams, particularly in the adult education research that we conducted, we effectively engaged our learners in a reflexive process, and they talked about this through the group interviews. It actually enabled them to think about, to reflect on those experiences, to analyse those experiences, and actually begin to understand some of the educational transitions that they were beginning to make as they progressed through the Access to HE course, and to actually understand that they had the potential to access higher education. And so the approach not only allowed our participants to examine those experiences, but it also led them towards a reflexive process, in the sense that they began to look at experiences anew as well. And secondly, the method of data collection helped to develop the learner's sense of agency here, so in which they visually expressed important aspects of their lives through the mind diagrams, and sometimes showing really strong intentionality and demonstrating clear purpose and direction. So the mind diagrams enabled the conceptualization of ideas and thinking about themselves as future learners in terms of their future ambitions and the changes that they were making, and being able to share those with others. And that drove the development of their learner sense of agency. And then finally, these methods allowed the learners to begin to create new self-images by taking control of their own representations. these mind diagrams assisted our participants in creating images about themselves and actually challenging predominant views of themselves, which were often very negative, towards a more positive self-image of themselves as a learner who had the potential to access higher education. Thank you for listening, and I'm going to hand over to Hugh, and that's my reference list if you're interested. So thank you.
I hope you can all hear me, but I'm going to cut and paste this presentation because of the time that we are already at. And this is about developing wise practice by thinking about the commonalities and contradictions of ethical research practice, so that not only researchers but research supervisors and indeed members of ethical review boards can develop phronesis. Phronesis is described by Traianu as wise practice through which researchers and their regulators can make situationally appropriate decisions that take account of all relevant and only relevant considerations. So this is important that we reflect critically on practice through different ethical frameworks that Alison described earlier on. And these different ethical frameworks can be used complementarily to review research projects located in a variety of different social situations, including internationally located and indeed originated projects. Ethical frameworks allow researchers to reflect critically on the messiness of the lived realities of their studies, the values that prompted them to undertake their studies, and how they communicated these to their participants. Now, we've heard several examples of these during these different presentations, from Martina about freelance language teachers, from Carmel about children, particularly those with glue ear, but actually what she was saying, I think, applies far more widely to children's involvement in research. And we have just heard now from Nalita talking about how mind diagrams or other visual methods can empower participants to articulate their views and make participants visible. So we don't need to rehearse that again, but we do need to then think ahead about how we can develop this process of developing wise practice, taking into account the whole gamut of different perspectives of people involved in research in various ways. And I would commend to you this book that is coming out at the end of November, which contains these discussions that you've been hearing and a lot of other discussions about thinking critically and ethically about research in education. And I'm going to stop sharing so that Carmel can take us back through everything. Over to you, Carmel.
Thank you. Okay. I think that we've got time for just a couple of questions. Thank you very much, Hugh, for finishing so quickly. The way that the platform works for the audience who may not know is that we can't see in the panel can't see the questions, but I have been posting questions as they've come through, and I really appreciate your comments. I haven't been replying because information overload. So I think having posted those questions, is there any question that kind of perhaps early on we had a question or comment, Alison, during your presentation, and I'm just trying to get back up there, about the comment from one. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I've seen that there's a couple of comments come through that Carmel's been able to share. They sort of ask the same sort of question, and it would be nice to have a chance to sort of just reflect on that a little more. So the questions were really around there being more appropriate ethical ways of thinking locally in the, sorry, I just nudged my iPad by mistake. There are local ways of ethical thinking that are more appropriate to the ones that you sort of feel like you're being encouraged to be held against, to be held accountable to. And so I think there is this tension between that you are multiply accountable. If you're working in a Western setting, it has got this Western ethical framework sitting behind the knowledge base really of the ethical board. And I think one of the things that we can do is that we can be educating our ethical boards about appropriate ways to work with children and young people, with the vulnerable groups that we become expert with